Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byronofsidius. And for today's Storyteller's Perspective, I'd like to take a look at Blades versus Blunt, a fantasy comparison. In the genre of fantasy fiction or literature, there tend to be two primary melee weapon archetypes that most fighter characters fall into, or warrior characters, as it were. And those two types are those who wield blades and those who wield blunt weapons. And I am sticking specifically to melee combat protagonists or antagonists because we could always end up diverting into a long-winded diatribe about the differences between longbows, short bows, crossbows, thrown spears or lances, and depending on your author of choice, firearms. But for now, and for this comparison purposes, we're looking at blades versus blunt weapons. The primary varieties of each type tend to fall into the following brackets. In blades, there are your daggers or dirks, short swords, long swords, bastard swords, great swords, and your sickle or scythe for a more exotic weapon sort or type. In the blunt weapon category, you tend to have saps, clubs or rods or batons, maces, warhammers, a bow staff, or, for an exotic flair, tonfa. In the fantasy genre, the importance of the material that the blade is constructed of tends to present often as far more important for a bladed weapon as opposed to the material that composes your blunt weapons. Think of your werewolves or your vampires in fantasy can only be afflicted or harmed by a silver blade. Similar with ghosts or specters, anything of an undead nature tends to be in most fantasy lore or legendarium, suffer greater affliction or weakness to silver-infused blades. There's not so much an emphasis in the blunt weapon category for what the weapon is composed of, so much as the weapon's density, its weight or heft. That tends to be far more vital and included in the descriptors surrounding a blunt weapon. In terms of competing with oppositional forces in fantasy literature, armor protection in most fantasy fiction seems to be a rather all-or-nothing matter for bladed weapons. Either the blade cleaves right through the armor, or somehow the wielder of the blade is expert enough to thrust a stab maneuver or technique into the joints of plated armor, or it just carves right through chain link or brigandine or leather armor. Yet for blunt weapons, there seems to be more of an emphasis on the degrees of damage to the armor itself for a blunt weapon. This is particularly true in the Thomas Covenant novels by Stephen R. Donaldson. Those members of the Ranihin, or the armies of the lords that Covenant allies himself with, in battle sequences, the damage dealt by blades to armor itself is either an entirely clean cut through the armor, or the blade gets dented or broken, or there's not a great degree of detail not a lot of time spent on conveying exactly how much damage is done to the armor itself, whereas blunt weapons striking armor tends to have a great deal more detail and description layered into the after effects of a successful blow that does not quite injure or damage the target, but does do considerable damage to the worn armor or held shields. This differentiation is another way in which there is a contrast between blade versus blunt weapons in fantasy literature. Another key distinction between these two types of weapon is in the depiction of damage. Blade wounds, for cuts and stab wounds, often get quite a great deal of precise descriptive attention from authors. You can see this in everything from the works of Brandon Sanderson to Robert Jordan to J.R.R. Tolkien, as I mentioned, Stephen R. Donaldson, Sir Terry Pratchett, Terry Brooks, Anne McCaffrey. Bladed weapons, when they deal a blow, there's often a tremendous amount of descriptive detail given. Blunt damage or blunt weapon damage is often given less coverage or detail. But when the details are present, as you can often find in the works of George R.R. Martin or, as I mentioned, Neil Gaiman, as well as a couple of instances wherein Jim Butcher's tales of Harry Dresden, you have trolls whose primary weapon of choice is a large club hewn from the limb of a tree. When a attack from such a weapon lands, the detail given to the injuries is usually quite gruesome. So again, it's not as frequent that you get those details, but when you do, it's really unpleasant. In terms of the depiction of those who wield these weapons in fantasy literature, blade wielders in fantasy tales often seem to be portrayed as being possessed of great swiftness and gracefulness. There tends to be an association with lithe human warriors or fighters, or elves, or other sylvan, narrow, or agile individuals who rely on technique and speed and mastery of the weapon. Whereas blunt weapon specialists tend to be portrayed or shown as absolute brutes, relying on raw strength. In terms of racial or species affinity in fantasy literature, you'll often find these weapons wielded by dwarves, minotaurs, hobgoblins, orcs, or trolls, creatures of a variety that are seen as somehow less intellectually capable, less acute, lacking in greater technique than those who wield a blade. In terms of mythological weight, there tends to be a strong preference for heroic figures in mythos and legendarium, historically and in modern fiction, to be depicted as wielding swords or blades. And some of those weapons are in and of themselves of the legendary variety. Just a quick example list to give you would be Excalibur from Arthurian legend, the Sword of Shannara. Fred Saberhagen has an entire series called the Books of Swords. There is the Masamune, the Murasam. There's Sting, wielded by Frodo, and the Anduril, Aragorn's sword. There's, in anime, there's the Tetsaiga, the Tenseiga in Inuyasha, every Zanpakuto in Bleach. There's the Soul Edge in the Kusanagi no Tsurugi. There's the Durandal, which is a historically significant mythological sword, or rather non-canonical. It's the indestructible blade of Roland, a paladin of Charlemagne. You can even look to another video game with the Master Sword in The Legend of Zelda, and this even applies to science fiction. Have you ever heard of a light axe? No, it's a light saber. Again, even Obi-Wan says a weapon from a more sophisticated time. For blunt weapons, on the other side, there is a notably smaller list of examples to pull from. There's the Mjolnir from Norse mythology, wielded by Thor. There is Sharur, from Sumerian lore, the mace wielded by the warrior god Ninurta. There's the Club of Heracles, or Hercules, which was said to be wielded by him in order to defeat the Lion of Niana, the impenetrable lion whose flesh could not be pierced. So Heracles used I believe it was an ash branch that was blessed by the gods to literally stave the lion's skull in. He couldn't pierce it with a blade or any kind of cut. So instead, he just smashed the thing's head open. There is the Sithis, the shape-shifting cane of Baron Samad, which could, upon his snapping his fingers, turn into a venomous snake that he would deploy against his enemies. And if that name sounds familiar to those of you who are fans of the Elder Scrolls lore, there's a reason for that. There's the Komodoki, which in Hindu mythos is a mace wielded by the god Vishnu. There's also, in modern fiction, Robert Baratheon's giant warhammer from the Song of Ice and Fire, also known as Game of Thrones. Baratheon's weapon of choice when he was rebelling against the Mad King Aegon was a gigantic warhammer. And to once again look into modern video game mythology, there's the vampire killer Morningstar whip from the Castlevania series. If one were to go down the absolute rabbit hole of fantasy-heavy video games historically that have placed a greater emphasis on swords over blunt weapons, however, we could be here, quite frankly, forever. And I don't intend to do that with this brief commentary. At least, that's not my intention. Lastly, for this presentation, I'd like to take note of the treatment of injuries for survivors of wounds from either of these types of weapons. This is possibly the singular area in myth and legends, both historically and in modern narratives, where blunt weaponry quite frankly trumps blades or swords, in that the brutality of recovering from or trading major wounds from a blunt weapon is far more unpleasant. A foot that's been cut in half or cut off sees the survivor use specialized footwear or healing magic or potions after the wound has healed over. There's all kinds of equipment that can be utilized to make up for a missing hand or a missing leg. A foot, however, that has been pulverized, dozens of small bones ground into dust inside of the muscle tissue, well, that adds in an extra layer of agony right up front, wherein the victim has to consider the possibility that they might be better off just hacking away the damaged area, if it's survivable to do so. And if they don't hack it off, do the bones, muscle, and flesh heal properly? Because if they are healed askew or out of sorts, that can leave the victim hobbled, crippled, or mangled. For a mythological example, I would ask you to look at Hephaestus, the blacksmith of the Greek gods in Olympus. He wasn't exactly known for, being beautiful when it came to that club foot of his. A foot that was clubbed because it had been smashed to pieces. Anyhow, this was just a brief look into the differentiation in the fantasy genre for the swords versus blunt weapons examination. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.